All right, let's just dive right in. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a magnifying glass to some really dense, but honestly fascinating academic theories about who actually holds the reins of the modern global economy. We're going to challenge those everyday assumptions we all make when we flip on the evening news. We'll be moving all the way from traditional state versus state models right up to some radical theories about a borderless global class struggle. It all starts with one massive question. Who really runs the world economy? I mean, when you feel the pinch of inflation at the grocery store, or you see global supply chains completely break down, who's actually pulling the levers? Now, it's super easy to assume that power just stops at national borders, that it's the United States, China, or the EU calling the shots. But in a world as interconnected as ours, does ultimate power truly live inside those borders? Is it just the invisible hand of the free market? Or, as some theorists are actually suggesting, is there a completely borderless global elite running the show?
So, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to look at 1. Lenses of global power. 2. The international class struggle. 3. The transnational capitalist class. 4. Tools of transnational rule. 5. Splits in the ruling class. And finally, 6. The third way. Okay, kicking things off with Section 1, Lenses of Global Power.
Now, to wrap our heads around the really radical theories, we first need a baseline. Traditionally, in what's called international political economy, or IPE, the global economy is viewed almost entirely as a giant playing field. And the players? They're competing sovereign nation-states. Basically, the borders on a map define exactly who the actors are.
Within that traditional worldview, you basically have two main camps. First, there's the liberal tradition. This side champions free markets, voluntary exchange, and this idea of an invisible hand that just naturally creates order out of chaos. It's a win-win mindset. But then, in stark contrast, you have the mercantilist tradition. And they view the world as a fierce, zero-sum arena of competition where countries have to maximize their own strength, power, and self-sufficiency just to survive. But here's the kicker. Notice what they both share? They both assume the nation-state is the absolute main character of the story.
Moving right along to Section 2, the international class struggle. But what if that traditional map is just entirely wrong? Well, enter the Marxist lens. This perspective completely reframes international relations. It's not a polite disagreement over trade treaties, it's seen as an inherent economic conflict. According to the source text by Chigora and Ziso, this worldview essentially divides countries into two strict groups. You have the oppressor, developed capitalist states sitting at the center, and the oppressed, developing countries on the periphery. Under this lens, the wealth of the developed world isn't just magically created out of thin air, it's actually appropriated or taken from workers in developing nations. In the core of this argument is summed up perfectly in this pretty bold quote from the source material: globalization is a combination of colonization and neo-colonialism. So the text points out that modern anti-capitalist movements look at current global economic policies, especially those pushed by Western institutions, and they see them as just a new form of imperial plunder. It's viewed as a system specifically rigged to keep developing nations poor while funneling all the wealth straight upward.
Which brings us to Section 3, the transnational capitalist class.
Now, researchers William Robinson and Jerry Harris take this whole idea of class struggle, but they give it a massive update for the 21st century. They argue that globalization has literally changed the rules of the game. We aren't dealing with national elites competing against each other anymore. Instead, they say a transnational capitalist class, or TCC, has emerged. This is a completely borderless global elite, literally forged by the globalization of production. They operate way above local territories, managing worldwide supply chains and financial markets. Their loyalty? It's not to any single flag or nation, it's to the global system of capital accumulation itself. And to ground this theory in some hard reality, let's look at the numbers the researchers point out, because they are staggering. By the late 1990s, the value of the global stock of foreign direct investment hit $4 trillion. Let me put that into perspective. $4 trillion was roughly the entire GDP of Japan at that time, just completely decentralized and scattered across the globe. Back then, around 40,000 multinational companies were handling 2/3 of all world trade. And we're not just talking about companies exporting finished goods. This is the complete global fragmentation of how things are actually made. The sheer massive scale of this financial integration is the physical infrastructure that supposedly gave birth to this borderless ruling class. All right, let's look at Section 4, Tools of Transnational Rule. So if this borderless class actually exists, how on earth do they exert their power? I mean, they don't have a global army, right? Well, Robinson and Harris proposed the existence of an emerging network they call the transnational state apparatus. We're talking about heavy hitters here: the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the World Economic Forum, and the Trilateral Commission. The text argues that these are absolutely not just neutral forums where countries go to politely cooperate. Instead, they function as a supranational infrastructure, kind of like a global government in its early stages, used by the elite to dictate economic restructuring, enforce free markets, and essentially squash any national policies that might get in the way of transnational capital.
Now, mainstream institutionalist approaches explain this a bit differently. They say these international institutions are given power simply to resolve collective action problems. Basically stepping in to play referee when nations can't agree on how to share the sandbox. But viewing this through the critical lens we're exploring today, these rules are specifically designed for one main purpose: to guarantee the smooth, unfettered flow of global capital. They harmonize standards across borders so that money can move instantly at the click of a button to wherever it's going to be the absolute most profitable.
Let's pivot to Section 5, Splits in the Ruling Class. Now, you might be thinking this global elite sounds like some perfectly unified monolith plotting in a smoky room, but the text argues they absolutely are not. In fact, when economic crises hit, they deeply fracture into three competing factions. First, you have the purists, the free market conservatives. They demand complete laissez-faire and zero bailouts. Basically, if a market fails, let it crash. Then you have the pragmatists, the neoliberal structuralists. This is the dominant faction. They want just enough regulation to save the big banks from destroying themselves. And finally, the appeasers, the neoliberal regulationists. They argue for social safety nets that are just robust enough to prevent actual political uprisings, all while keeping global capitalism chugging along. So why are these factions fighting each other so intensely? Well, because the stakes are just unimaginably high. Our source material notes that a mind-boggling $1.3 trillion is traded daily in global currency markets. Daily! And mostly, it's just for short-term speculation. This creates terrifying extreme volatility. The text actually quotes one speculator who compares the markets to a giant wrecking ball that can swing in and knock over entire economies, literally overnight. So, these splits in the ruling class, they are fundamentally desperate arguments about how to manage a hyper-volatile system to avoid a total catastrophic collapse. And that brings us to our final section, Section 6. The third way. Okay, so how exactly does this divided elite try to stabilize things and appease a highly polarized world? The text argues that they tend to coalesce around a political configuration known as the third way. The logic here strongly reaffirms free market principles, but it attempts to soften the blow. It heavily pushes this culture of market individualism and flexible labor markets. Think about the modern gig economy: Uber drivers, endless contract work, perpetual freelancers. But at the very same time, it rolls back traditional state-funded welfare. So essentially, it takes the heavy burden of social welfare and survival, lifts it off the shoulders of the state, and drops it squarely onto decentralized and often marginalized communities themselves. And the ultimate result of this system, well, the researchers describe the creation of a deeply polarized, three-tiered global society. Tier 1, the tenured. These are the folks with secure employment and high levels of consumption. Tier 2, the casualized. This is a massive, growing army of insecure, flexible workers who face just chronic instability. And finally, Tier 3, the superfluous. These are the structurally excluded populations. It's a really harsh word, isn't it? Superfluous. Unnecessary. The text suggests that to manage the specific marginalized group, the elite increasingly has to rely on a politics of exclusion, basically leaning heavily on police and security forces to contain the people that the global economy simply decides it no longer needs. Which leaves us with one final massive question to chew on today based on all these readings. Will this third way actually succeed in stabilizing global capitalism? Or are the contradictions in the system so deep and so extreme that an unprecedented, completely borderless, transnational class struggle is just inevitably on the horizon? It is a truly fascinating and definitely provocative way to rethink how our world operates behind the scenes. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack all of this. Keep questioning the structures around you, and I will see you in the next explainer.